part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hello, and welcome back to the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. This is Ben Billman, and I'm really looking forward to this episode today. We've got a lot to talk about. In the first half, we'll talk about what's going on in the world of college basketball, some of the big games coming up over the next couple of days. And in the second half, I'm going to take a dive into the best programs that have never been to a Final Four. Last week, we looked at the best coaches that have never been to a Final Four. This week, we'll look at the best programs. So let's get into it. It's interesting this time of year in college basketball because it's final exam time on a lot of campuses across the country. And so over the last week or so, a lot of teams have maybe had a game or two, but they're not playing the big-time games like they normally do in the non-conference. And basically what we have now is a setup where between now and Christmas, there are going to be some huge games in the non-conference that I want to talk about. Before we get into that, though, just a little bit of update on where we are in the top 25. Arizona is clearly the number one team. They're undefeated. They look like they're going to be the class of the Pac-12. We'll talk about an upcoming game for them this weekend in just a couple minutes. But I think Arizona is pretty unanimous that they are the number one team in America. The top 10 really did not have many changes this week. Other than Gonzaga dropping a little bit, they went from 7 all the way down to 10 after a loss. But other than that, the top 10 is about the same. The biggest risers this week, first of all, Oklahoma. And then also keep an eye on Clemson. Both Oklahoma and Clemson are undefeated. We are running low on undefeated teams at this point. Those two teams, though, both look like entering conference play. They're very solid teams, especially Clemson in an ACC where Duke and Virginia and Miami are still trying to find themselves and figure themselves out. Clemson has a real opportunity here to do something special in the ACC. A couple other teams that fell a little bit. Colorado State and BYU both picked up their first loss over this past week, so they both fell into the mid-teens at 17 and 18. I'm still not worried about either of those teams. I think they'll both do well in conference play, but they did drop a little bit over this past week. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, with Miami still trying to find themselves, they dropped all the way down to number 24, almost out of the top 25. About 2 weeks ago, I would have probably said that Miami was a top 3 team in the ACC. Now, I'm not exactly sure where they would finish. With the rise of Clemson, Duke looks like they're getting back on track, and Virginia has made a push. Miami might be out of that top 3 or 4 at this point. And then the last team just snuck in at number 25, Northwestern. They got a huge win over Purdue, and now they have snuck into the top 25. Chris Collins, the job he has done at Northwestern is pretty incredible. They also have updated facilities there, and Northwestern looks like a program that for years was in the basement of the Big Ten. They are now a tournament contender almost every single year, and Chris Collins deserves the credit for that, getting them to that point. So that's a little bit of an update on the top 25. Again, not a whole lot of games over the past week to talk about, but when we look ahead to this upcoming weekend, it is loaded with big games. If you're a college basketball fan, you're going to want to watch some of the games this weekend. So I want to go through these games real quick that are upcoming and talk a little bit about what the implications are for some of the teams based on these games. So we're going to start with the first game, which takes place on Thursday the 14th. We have number 5 Connecticut traveling to Seattle to play number 10 Gonzaga. So a top 10 matchup in just a short amount of time. I think the implications for this game, first of all, Connecticut, they already have a few big non-conference wins, but this would definitely cement them as the favorite in the Big East going into conference play and just give them more of a solid look at a number 1 seed. And overall, this would definitely be a win that would propel them not just into repeat national champion status, but put them as one of the favorites overall. For Gonzaga, being in the West Coast Conference, this is really the last opportunity Gonzaga has to get a top-tier win before they enter conference play. So this could be a big win for Gonzaga as far as boosting their tournament resume. It's really probably going to be the last top 25 team that they play. The West Coast Conference just does not offer that. So the strength of schedule is going to drop dramatically over the next couple weeks and months for Gonzaga. If they are able to win this game, though, I think they still have a chance to be in that 1 line, the number 1 seed line, when it comes to March. A loss here, they just may not be able to look at their resume and say, hey, we have a lot of wins that stand out on our resume. So UConn Gonzaga in Seattle on Thursday. That is kind of the appetizer for what is coming up on Saturday. Maybe the best day of non-conference games for sure this year, and maybe as long as I can remember. There are just so many good games. A few that stand out, and I'm going to go in order of importance, starting at the bottom and going up to the top. So there are a couple games that I want to touch on that are coming up on Saturday for more of the mid-major range. For those of you that are looking for those Cinderella-type teams come March, these are the teams that would fill that role. And these games on Saturday are very important to see how these teams would do against equal competition and would be big wins for either of these teams going into conference play. First of all, Utah State is playing San Francisco. Utah State is always a team in the Mountain West that does well. And San Francisco being in the West Coast Conference with Gonzaga, either of these teams with a win is going to be riding high into conference play. An in-state rival, Cincinnati versus Dayton, both very solid teams. We've seen both teams have pretty good success over the last couple years. And the winner of this game is going to have a nice resume builder, especially with Cincinnati, who hasn't been super impressive so far. If they could pick up a win over Dayton going into conference play in the Big East, I think that would be a huge win. The Big 12. I think that would be a huge win for them going into conference play. Another game that I think holds pretty big implications for the bubble situation going into March is TCU versus Arizona State. Two teams that I haven't been able to watch a lot of, but both have had fairly good success in recent years. This game, again, could be a game that both teams look back on and say, man, that win very, very well helped us, or that loss hurt us overall. And then finally, Ohio State and UCLA. Both very young teams, both with mild expectations going in to conference season. And again, the winner of that game will have something to build upon going into conference play. None of those teams are ranked, though, right now. So there really isn't a possibility for those games to be on the national scene where a lot of people are going to be focusing on them. But there are a handful of games now with ranked teams that are going to be nationally televised, and we're really going to see a breakdown of some of the best basketball and where these teams stand. So first of all, on Saturday, we have number 12 Tennessee going up against North Carolina State in San Antonio. Tennessee, they're still trying to find their footing after a 3-game losing streak over the past couple of weeks. A win over North Carolina State could kind of show that they've gotten through that little fall in competition. For North Carolina State, a team in the ACC that not a lot of people had very high expectations for, if they could somehow knock off Tennessee, now we're looking at NC State as a team that could finish in the top half of the ACC, and this game would go very far as a resume builder going into March. Next up, we have number 15 Florida Atlantic versus St. Bonaventure. Florida Atlantic, I think, is a team that is going to get in the tournament no matter what. They are moving up to the American Athletic Conference, the AAC. The AAC still does not have the depth or the strength that I think would be enough to knock out Florida Atlantic. This would be a nice win for Florida Atlantic over St. Bonnie, but I don't think if they lose this game, it would have huge implications on March for them. On the other side, though, if St. Bonaventure were to win this game, in the Atlantic 10, again, a conference that has had solid teams in the past, but this would put St. Bonaventure all of a sudden in the discussion of the best teams in the Atlantic 10, and another win that they could look back on and say, this was a quality win we had in non-conference, we challenged ourselves, we got this victory, and we deserve an at-large bid if we do not win our conference. The next game, and now we're getting into some huge games, number 19 Texas against LSU. And this game will be taking place in Houston. Texas, again, an Elite Eight team from last year. They have some nice wins. They also have some bad losses so far this year. They are a team going into the Big 12, the best conference in America. A win against LSU would be huge. A loss against LSU, and they get passed up by a lot of teams in the Big 12. For LSU, they're still in the rebuilding mode after what happened a couple years ago with the breakdown of their team. A win for LSU against a very tough Texas team would go a long way. I don't think LSU is a tournament team by any stretch, but if they were able to beat Texas, that would be a huge program builder moving forward for them. Number 2, Kansas plays Indiana. Now, for Kansas, this is a game that will solidify them as a number 1 seed going into conference play. Kansas is going to contend for a Big 12 title and a national title. So for them, this would be a nice win, but for Indiana, this would be monumental. This would be the biggest win of their season up to this point. This would be a game that would immediately put them back in the national limelight heading into the Big Ten. The Big Ten, other than Purdue, seems like it's pretty wide open right now. And if Indiana can beat Kansas, this would be a huge confidence builder and a game that they can look back on and say, this is when our season really took off. Number 13, Clemson, plays Memphis on Saturday as well. Clemson, still undefeated, and like I mentioned earlier, this could be a team, a dark horse to win the ACC, And their run for an ACC championship will kind of be defined on how this game goes this Saturday against Memphis. Memphis is another team that is looking for a season-defining win, and again, a win against an undefeated Clemson team who is ranked number 13 at this moment would be a huge win for Penny Hardaway and his program. So watch out for that game as well. Number 6, Baylor is playing Michigan State. At the beginning of the year, you'd probably look at this game and say, biggest game of the year. Both teams at the beginning of the year were ranked top 15. But man, if there's a team that has just fallen apart since the season started, it's Michigan State. They have just looked awful so far this year. And I don't even know at this point, if the tournament started today, if they would even be considered as a bubble team. I don't think they make the tournament. So for Baylor, this is a win that they almost have to have. If Michigan State is a team that doesn't make the tournament and Baylor loses to them, Baylor would probably lose out on a 1 seed because of that. So for Baylor, this is a game that is crucial, again, going into a very tough Big 12. For Michigan State, this could be a game that maybe changes the course of their season if they can beat a top 10 team in Baylor. Number 8, Creighton is playing Alabama this weekend. Creighton looks like a top 2 team in the Big East. Them and Connecticut look like the 2 best teams right now. I don't think this game has huge implications for Creighton, but it does for Alabama. Alabama needs this win. Any SEC team needs to win this weekend to prove on the national stage that they have what it takes to have a good conference. Right now, I don't know if there's a team in the SEC that is good enough to compete for a national title. So a win here for Alabama would be a nice transition into conference play against a top 10 team. An in-state matchup will take place between number 4 Houston and Texas A&M. Houston has continually been in the top 5 all season. I think they will stay there. And again, moving into the Big 12, a win over Texas A&M would be huge. For Texas A&M, as I talked about with Alabama, a lot of question marks in the SEC. Texas A&M being one of those teams that could potentially fall apart or move all the way up to the top of the rankings depending on how this game goes. A win over Houston, now we're looking at Texas A&M as a team that we thought would compete for an SEC title at the beginning of the year. This would push them right back into that conversation. And then the top 2 games of the weekend, I don't think anyone can dispute with these. They are far and away the best matchups with huge implications really for the top of the bracket when it comes to March. Number 9, North Carolina versus number 14, Kentucky. This feels like an Elite 8, Final Four type of matchup. 2 teams, blue blood programs. The winner of this game is going to have to feel like they've got a number 1 seed in sight. The loser of this game still has to feel pretty good about things. But again, this would be at the top of the list when you're looking at resumes come March. So North Carolina, Kentucky, both teams with a lot to prove, both with very high expectations. And I think both feeling like no matter the outcome of this game, they are both conference championship level teams. And then the game of the weekend, if you can only pick one game to watch all weekend, it would be number 1 Arizona versus number 3 Purdue in Indianapolis. The winner of this game will be considered the number 1 team in the country heading into conference play. Arizona undefeated, Purdue with 1 loss. This will have the feel of a national championship level game. I think if you're going to focus on this game, the things to watch for, first of all, Zach Edey how does he look against high-end competition? And then for Arizona, a lot of young players on this roster. Can they control the tempo? And then obviously, can they control Zach Edey around the rim? Both these teams, I believe, at the end of the year will be number 1 seeds. And if I was to fill out a bracket today, they would both be in my Final Four. So those are the games this weekend. It is a buffet, a smorgasbord of good games coming up this weekend. Keep an eye on them. They all hold big implications for March and also heading into conference play. All right, let's take a quick break for a couple advertisements, and then we'll come back with the second half.
Hey everybody, it's Sam Amico from Cavs on the Break NBA podcast. Be sure to give us a listen for all your Cleveland Cavaliers recaps, analysis, breakdowns, draft talk, free agency. The list goes on and on. Give us a listen, Cavs on the Break NBA podcast.
What's up, everyone? I'm Holly Wetzel.
And I'm Tybus Powell.
And we are your hosts of The Orange is Oranger, a Cleveland Browns podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. We give you all the dog pound coverage that you'll need to get you through the regular season, hopeful postseason, and I'd say off-season, Tybus, but is there really ever an off-season for this team?
Thankfully for our podcast, Holly, there really never is when it comes to the Cleveland Browns. Don't miss our breakdown of each week's matchup, game recaps, and any and all news out of Berea to feed your Browns appetite. As we know, Holly, dogs gotta eat.
Yes, they do. So hit that subscribe button and never miss an episode of the Orange is Oranger, Cleveland Browns podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network.
All right, welcome back to the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. So last week we took a look at college basketball coaches that have yet to make a Final Four appearance as a head coach. And this week I want to turn my attention to college basketball programs that have yet to make a Final Four. Like I mentioned with the coaches, the Final Four is a proving ground and a mark of greatness when it comes to coaches, but also with programs. So I've been put together a top 10 list of the teams that have yet to make the Final Four. I'm going to list those off from 10 to 1, and I'm going to give my percentage chance that within the next 5 years, this program will make or won't make the Final Four. So let's get things kicked off with my team number 10 on the list of teams that have not yet made a Final Four in the history of the NCAA tournament, which dates back to 1939. So number 10 on my list, I have Davidson. Davidson most recently made the Elite Eight in 2008, one of the greatest Cinderella story runs of all time. Steph Curry almost single-handedly took this team from a double-digit seed all the way to the Elite Eight, lost to Kansas in a one-possession game. Davidson had the ball on the last possession with a chance to win or tie, and for some reason Steph Curry passed up the final shot, which ended up just bouncing off the rim or the backboard, not going in, and that was it for Davidson that year. That was not the only time, though, that Davidson made the Elite Eight. They also had appearances in 1968 and 1969. Along with that, they have also made it to 4 Sweet 16s in their history as well. Now, looking at Davidson over the next 5 years, is this a program that I think could break this Final Four drought? My answer would be no. Bob McKillop, the longtime coach at Davidson, just retired a couple of years ago, so they're kind of in a new stage of that program. I do not see Davidson getting back to that level anytime soon. So unfortunately, if you're a Davidson fan, This streak is probably going to last for quite a while. Steph Curry obviously was a once-in-a-generation type player at Davidson, and I just don't see much hope for them moving forward. At number 9 on my list is Utah State. Utah State is a team that year in and year out is always a threat in the Mountain West Conference. They have been to 23 NCAA tournaments. They have made it to 2 Elite Eights. In 1939, they made it to the first ever the Elite Eight. And then in 1970, they made it again. They have not gotten very close since then, but they're always a team that you do not want to see on the other side of a matchup in the NCAA tournament. Coach Merrill was there for a long time. He's had great success in the Mountain West, but again, recently they just have not advanced very far in the tournament. Looking over the next 5 years, could I see Utah State making a run to the Final Four? I would say there's a 10% chance that Utah State does that. We have seen Mountain West teams go pretty far, including last year, San Diego State making it to the national championship game. So I'm not going to totally count out Utah State, but it would be very, very difficult for them to get to that level. All right, number 8 on my list of the best programs in college basketball that have not yet made it to a Final Four. Out of the Pac-12, I have Arizona State. So Arizona State has made it to 3 Elite Eights. They've had the chance 3 times. They've been 1 win away from making it to the Final Four. 1961, 1963, and 1975. 3 Elite Eights, yet to have a Final Four. Most recently, James Harden, back in the mid-2000s, was on that team. Really didn't have much success, but Arizona State is not a team that struggles with recruiting. They have everything that they need to be successful. Next year, they're moving over to the Big 12, so a lot of big changes coming for that program, and I'm not sure exactly how that's going to affect that team. They do have Coach Hurley. I think he'll be there for quite a while, so maybe they'll be able to do that. Looking at the next 5 years, along with Utah State, I would give Arizona State about a 10% chance. They're not that great this year, and moving over to the Big 12 next year, I think is going to be a major challenge with the number of good quality teams in the Big 12. Arizona State might get stuck in the bottom half of that conference, at least for the time being. So I give them a 10% chance of making it to the Final Four in the next 5 years. Number 7 on my list is Creighton, the Creighton Blue Jays. Under Coach McDermott, they have made some real pushes in the NCAA tournament, including last year making it to the Elite Eight before losing to San Diego State. I think Coach McDermott has done a great job with that program. They have made 2 Elite Eights, the one last year and then also in 1941. But they really took a huge step not too long ago when they joined the Big East Conference. In recent years, about 20 years ago, Kyle Korver was a big-time player, and then Coach McDermott's son, Doug McDermott, was a National Player of the Year. They can get talent there, and they've got another team this year which I think can compete for a Final Four. So if I had to give a percentage chance that Creighton will make the Final Four in the next 5 years, I think it's 50-50. I think they have a great chance to do it. They have consistently been at the top of the Big East standings. They have consistently been in the top 15, top 20 in the country. And they are a second weekend threat, which means Sweet 16 or further almost every single year. I think Doug McDermott was the start of an era, and his dad Greg has been very successful since he took over at Creighton. I would say it's a 50% chance Creighton makes it in the next 5 years, and it wouldn't shock me to see them make it this year. The Big East is very tough, though. They are a team, though, that I think if they play well in the Big East, they could be a 2 or a 3 seed in the NCAA tournament, and the path would be there to make the Final Four. Number 6 on my list of teams that have yet to make the Final Four would be Alabama. Alabama last year was a number 1 seed, probably the best chance that they as a program have ever had to make it to the Final Four. They were not just the number 1 seed, they were the number 1 overall seed as well. The best team in the country heading into March. They've made 23 NCAA appearances, 9 Sweet 16s, and they have also made it to 1 Elite 8, and that was in 2004. Last year's team as a number 1 seed, the number 1 overall seed, lost in the Sweet 16 to San Diego State. It seems like a trend that every team on this list is either associated with San Diego State or lost to them. Alabama, though, has had legendary players such as Reggie King, Derek McKee, who was a star in the 90s, and then last year with Brandon Miller, who was one of the best players in college basketball last year. Top 3 pick in the NBA draft this past summer, and looks like he's going to have a long, successful NBA career. But unfortunately, they could not turn the success and talent of Brandon Miller into a Final Four run last year. So Alabama, if I had to predict a Final Four run in the next 5 years, I would give them about a 40% chance. I think what they have going on there right now is extremely good. I think they've got a lot of talented players that are coming in there. They spent a lot of money on their college basketball team, and it would not surprise me in the next 5 years to see Alabama get there with the NIL money they're giving. And I think the success last year has brought a lot of interest and intrigue to that Alabama program. It also doesn't hurt that their football program is also the best program over the last 15 years, and so that always helps recruiting as well. All right, so now I'm into the top 5 of the best programs of all time that have yet to make it to a Final Four. So let's go with number 5, and there I've got Boston College. So Boston College is a program that over the last decade or so has been in a miserable period of their history. They have not been successful at all. They really struggle even to make the tournament. Even competing in the ACC has been a struggle. So we can't look at the last 10 or so years of Boston College when it comes to their success overall. What we have to do is look back at their history and see that they're a program that has made it to 18 tournaments. They've been to 9 Sweet 16s. They've made it to 3 Elite 8s. Those 3 Elite 8s were in 67, 82, and 94 being the most recent. So again, they do not have the recency bias of some of these other programs, but they are still a program historically that has been very solid, and with the right set of circumstances has been successful when they were in the Big East and now in the ACC. The problem is the ACC is so tough nowadays with Duke, North Carolina, NC State, Virginia. The list goes on and on. It is tough to break into that upper half. Boston College has yet to do that. I give Boston College a 10% chance over the next 5 years to make the Final Four. I just do not see a huge path if they can sneak into the tournament, there might be something there. But over the next 5 years, I think it's going to be a struggle even to make it to the NCAA tournament. So I give Boston College a 10% chance. All right, we're about to take a big jump here. I think these top 4 teams speak for themselves, and you might be a little bit shocked when you hear these names of teams that have not made a Final Four. So at number 4 on this list, I have the Tennessee Volunteers. You would think over the history of college basketball, at some point, Tennessee would have snuck into the Final Four. They have not. They've made it to 25 tournaments, 9 Sweet 16s, but surprisingly, they've only been to 1 Elite 8. They've only had 1 opportunity where they were a game away from the Final Four, and that was in 2010 when Bruce Pearl was the coach. So only 1 Elite 8, but they have had stars such as Bernard King, Dale Ellis, Allen Houston in the 90s, but for whatever reason, Tennessee, the Final Four has been their kryptonite. Now, percent chance that I think they make it to the Final Four over the next 5 years. First of all, I think this year's team has an unbelievable chance of getting there. We'll see what happens in the future. I would give Tennessee a 60% chance of making it to the Final Four in the next 5 years. This year, if they're going to do it, this would be the year to do it. A lot of experience. Coach Barnes is a good coach. They went to the Sweet 16 last year. I think they're going to be a top 3 or 4 seed this year. They're going to be a tough out in March. So I would say Tennessee, probably of anyone on this list, has the best opportunity, at least this year, to make it to the Final Four and break that 0 streak when it comes to Final Four appearances. At number 3, I have Missouri, the Missouri Tigers. Missouri has made it to 28 NCAA tournaments. They've been to 6 Sweet 16s, and they have been to 5 Elite 8s. Now, technically they've been to 4. If you look in the record books, 1994, that Elite 8 appearance was taken away because of violations. So in reality, they've been to 5, but technically they've been to 4 Elite 8s, the most recent in 2009. So they've made the Final Four, or the Elite 8 in 44, 76, 94, which was taken away, 02, and 09. So they have had a huge amount of tournament success, but again, they have not yet made it to the Final Four. In recent years, they've had players such as Jordan Clarkson, Michael Porter Jr. Last year, they had a really good team that made it to the second round, but unfortunately, they lost to Princeton in the second round. I think they're a stable program, though, and a program to keep an eye on in the SEC. Once again, the SEC is adding Texas and Oklahoma next year. That might push them down in the rankings and the pecking order a little bit. But Missouri is a team that consistently is in the middle of the pack to the top half of the SEC. I give Missouri a 25% chance over the next 5 years to make it to the Final Four. I went back and forth with the top 2 teams on this list. I think I could have put either team at the top, but I decided at number 2 on the list of programs that have yet to make the Final Four, I have BYU, Brigham Young University. Of the teams on this list, they have the most NCAA tournament appearances at 30. They have made it to 7 Sweet 16s, and they have made it to 3 Elite 8s. They made it in 1950, 1951, and 1981. So they've had a lot of tournament success. They're in the tournament almost every year. You might remember back about 10, 15 years ago, Jimmer Fredette, great player, got them to the Sweet 16, but unfortunately they could not advance to the Final Four. They also had Danny Ainge back in the late 70s, early 80s. Same thing. Great player, but just could not reach the Final Four. BYU is a program, again, that just joined the Big 12. We will see this year how that affects this program. They're off to a very good start this year in non-conference. Can they continue that in the conference play? I give BYU about a 25% chance in the next 5 years to make it to the Final Four. I think recruiting is going to increase. The amount of money they spend on basketball is going to increase. BYU at home is always a tough place to play. So I have BYU at number 2 on my list of the best programs to never make it to the Final Four. And then number 1 on my list, the best program in college basketball to never make it to the Final Four is Xavier. Xavier in the Big East has made 29 NCAA tournament appearances. They've made it to 9 Sweet 16s, and they've made it to 3 Elite Eights. All 3 of those have been fairly recently in 2004, 2008, and 2017. And combine that with the fact that they've had 1, 2, or 3 seeds multiple times in the last couple of years, it's pretty shocking that Xavier has not gotten there. Along with the fact that they have had some high-level coaches in Thad Matta, Sean Miller, and now Sean Miller again is back after a few years of being at Arizona. So, very surprising that Xavier has never been there, with players like David West, Tyrone Hill, Brian Grant, historical college players, and yet that program, for whatever reason, has yet to make it to the Final Four. I still think they're one of the top programs in the Big East. I give them a 75% chance of making it to the Final Four in the next 5 years. Xavier is a team that is continually building in the Big East. Sean Miller is back. This is his second year back at Xavier. I think Xavier has a very, very good opportunity, maybe not this year necessarily, but over the next 5 years, I'd be fairly surprised if they at least did not make it to the Elite Eight, and I think they have the opportunity to also make it to the Final Four. So that is my list of the 10 programs, college basketball programs, that have not yet made it to the Final Four. There is hope, though, for some of those teams. Others, I'm just not seeing it anytime soon. But with the craziness of March, you just never know. You really don't know. Florida Atlantic, I would have never thought would make the Final Four last year, and yet they did. So until the season concludes, until the Final Four is set, anything can happen. Well, thank you for listening to the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast. Enjoy this upcoming weekend of basketball games. It's going to be a great weekend, the last big weekend of games before we get into conference season in early January. I really appreciate it, and you all have a good week ahead. Thank you for listening to the Press Play Podcast Network. To follow us on X, look up Press Play Pods. For sponsorship plans and more information, please email admin@pressplaypodcast.com. And to listen to all our shows and learn more about our network, please visit www.pressplaypodcasts.com.